Welcome to Slight Reliability, learning SRE one day at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend. Hello and welcome back to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn about SRE and observability 1 week at a time. Welcome to the new year, 2023. It has arrived. This is the new year of the podcast. And today, to kick things off, I thought we'd do something really simple. So as an SRE, and now also developer advocate, I want to learn and continually get better at my work. And I want to be aware of what's going on around the industry as well. So how do I do that? One of the things that I only started doing about a year and a half ago was reading books. It wasn't something I valued before that, and I often thought, well, books go out of date really quickly, but I'm glad that I've got into it. I think the first book that really blew me away was The Phoenix Project, and if you haven't read it, I'd say you definitely should. But I wanted to talk about the books that I read last year as an SRE to try and be better at what I do. The first book that I read was Google's Site Reliability Engineering book, which every SRE or person who intends to be an SRE or is even interested in it should start reading. But I wouldn't necessarily read it cover to cover. You can actually access it completely free online, and I'll put a link in the description. Because it is not a novel, it is not a book designed just to read cover to cover, and it takes you on a journey necessarily. There's some really nitty gritty detailed stuff, especially around load balancing algorithms. So I would focus on the start of the book and the end of the book just to get terminology, a shared understanding about what it's all about, and to get that history of where it all came from as well. Now, the way that I have been reading is that I start with an audio book because I find that is incredibly helpful for me because I can walk the dogs, go for a run, be at the supermarket, and be consuming content because I don't necessarily have the time to sit down and just read a book all the time. So I start with an audio book, and if I like the book and I want to refer back to it, I buy a hard copy. And the next book that I wanted to mention is called Sooner, Safer, Happier by Jonathan Smart. The full name of the book is, I think, Sooner, Safer, Happier, Anti-Patterns and Patterns for Business Agility. It is, aside from the Phoenix Project, the best book that I've ever read about technology. And you'll notice it's not about SRE. There's not that many books about SRE. So I read books about technology, about how we deliver, how we operate, culture, organizations, business, all those things help provide a context and I think make you a better engineer or a better consultant or whatever it is that your role entails. So Sooner, Safer, Happier, I did buy a hard copy. It is absolutely fantastic. If you are in a complex enterprise or government agency potentially, where there's a lot of history and a lot of dysfunction, maybe inefficiencies, opportunities for improvement, this is the absolute best book I could possibly recommend. It paints a picture of how we commonly deliver and operate software and technology outcomes versus how it could be and what that shift looks like and how we can go about that. The third book I read was The Toyota Way, which I've already done a podcast episode on, so I won't go into too much detail. But it basically uses Toyota as an example of a continually growing organization with a focus, I guess, on the lean principles that they've adopted over time and how that can easily be applied to a technology organization as well. The fourth book I read was called Remote Office Not Required by Jason Fried. I think you pronounce his name. It's a book about working from home. It was written and released prior to COVID. So in a lot of ways, it's a little bit out of date in terms of how mainstream working from home has become. But there was still some pretty good stuff in there, but I wouldn't absolutely recommend it as a must-read book for anyone who works from home. I was interested because I was about to take on a 100% remote role, which I'm currently in, so I wanted to learn more about that and how I could make that work. The fifth book that I read was called Driving Digital Strategy by Sunil Gupta. It wasn't particularly related to SRE or observability, or even necessarily technology to a degree. It had a sort of business leadership lens about how to take ideas to market in the digital age. It was kind of terrifying at times, talking about the way in which organizations can market and almost manipulate the population to get them to buy products, the way that different brands sort of interconnect with each other in order to achieve collective outcomes. But then I kept thinking, well, what does that mean for the end customers? We're kind of these guinea pigs, which are just there to be manipulated. Anyway, it was a little bit terrifying, but kind of eye-opening. And there were some really interesting ideas in there, such as crowdsourcing innovation, which I thought was fantastic. The sixth book I also already talked about, which is Team Topologies, which is really introducing these 4 different topologies or types of team that operate in an effective way within a technology organization. And just as a recap of what those 4 were, there were stream-aligned teams, who are the traditional sort of DevOps teams who deliver and operate software. There were complex subsystem teams, who are teams who look after a very complex component which needs to be treated independently. There were platform teams who run the underlying software and tools and products which the stream-aligned teams require. And then enablement teams, which are teams who help enable and innovate and empower other teams to do better. The 7th book that I read was Accelerate, and the long name for that book is Accelerate, the Science of Lean Software and DevOps, Building and Scaling High-Performing Technology Organizations by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Jen Kim, which was a book I was really looking forward to reading. I'd heard a lot about it. I thought this is going to be the Holy Grail. I was somewhat disappointed about it. It was a little bit like an explanation. So if you're familiar with the State of DevOps reports or DORA metrics and that kind of thing, it was essentially a book explaining how they came about and the science behind it, and then the patterns and the lessons learned from those reports as well, and those sort of common themes that come up around organizations which are high performing. It was kind of interesting. It wasn't as hard hitting for me as Sooner Safer Happier or even the Phoenix Project. But if you are interested in improving your organization and helping improve agility and reliability, then I think it's a good book to read anyway and take some notes from. Finally, the last book that I read last year was called The Manager's Path. And don't be misled by the title. It's really about technology management. And it really talks about the journey going from you're a senior engineer, what next? And there are different options as an individual contributor or as a manager, but that path to manager is very different than anything you've done as a senior engineer before. And so it goes through all the different stages of becoming a mentor and then becoming a tech lead maybe, or then becoming a manager of a small team, but then eventually becoming managers of managers through to sort of C-level or CTO type roles as well. So a very good book if you're interested or thinking about how you can make a bigger impact on an organization than just individual contribution. And if you're interested particularly in becoming a manager, I think it's absolutely worth a read because there's too many situations in our industry where a senior engineer who knows a lot of stuff and seems senior and competent gets made a manager, and that isn't necessarily a good idea, and they're not necessarily given any support or guidance because it's a completely different skill set. In terms of what I'm reading now, I'm currently reading Staff Engineer by Will Larson, which is sort of the opposite side of things. It's about becoming a individual contributor beyond sort of senior engineer. So you're staff engineer, principal engineer, tech lead, those kinds of roles. So I'm currently reading that. I also have a book called Getting Things Done on my list of things to read. Another one, a short one called Thinking Fast and Slow. And Lean Enterprise is another book that I've already purchased. I haven't got around to listening to the audiobook of that. And beyond books, I am continually listening to some podcasts. I'm currently going through Open Observability Talks, and I'm currently also listening to On Call Me Maybe. So those are the two sort of SRE observability type podcasts that I've been listening to, and I occasionally listen to Pure Performance as well. And I follow certain individuals on Twitter and Mastodon and LinkedIn as well to learn what I can there. And I also learn quite a lot from staying in touch with previous colleagues who've gone to other organizations and hearing about what they're doing and what they're learning as well. So that's how I try and keep my knowledge up to date, how I try and be better at what I do as well. I hope that maybe one of these books speaks to you and you think, you know what, that's interesting. I'm glad I heard about that. Now I can go and read or listen to the audiobook of that book. So that's all from another episode of Slight Reliability. Thank you once again for tuning in. I just wanted to kick the year off nice and slow, nice and simple. There are lots of interviews in the pipeline as well as solo episodes. I've got a whole backlog of content to release, so I'm looking forward to that. And I hope that you had a good break over the New Year's period and got some rest and feel energized for the year to come. All right, I'll see you all next time.